Mark in Florida, you're on with Jim and Matt. How are you?
Matt, it is a great pleasure to speak with you. And Jim, it's great to see you today, too. I'm doing great and hope you guys are as well.
Yeah, it says here you had a question about kind of like how much evidence is required and why should you withhold belief until that standard's met?
Yeah, that's right. I've listened to a lot of
Okay.
I've listened to a lot of your stuff and been very impressed with the work you do. And one of the things I've heard you say quite often is that the time to believe a proposition is when there is sufficient evidence to support that proposition. And so my question is, what is the standard of proof that we ought to apply before we're willing to accept a proposition or before we're willing to believe?
It depends on the proposition. Not all propositions are created equal. I'm going to do a
start with one that can I throw one out that's a little bit easier?
What?
Throw one out that's a little easier to understand than a little more generally agreed upon than God. Say, for example, I believe that there is intelligent life spread throughout the universe, and that intelligent life exists on billions of planets throughout the universe.
What's your evidence that compels you to believe that?
Well, when you say, why do I believe something, I think there's the honest answer, and then I think there's the rational answer. And the honest answer is one that I don't often hear on your program, which is that it satisfies...
Hang on. First of all...
The honest answer...
No. I'm going to mute you for a second, and then I'll take you off mute because I don't want this to... So first of all, for me, the honest answer and the rational answer should be the same, if we're talking about an honest person. However, when you say that you don't usually hear the honest answer on our program, that's a little disturbing. So do you think we're being dishonest here, or are you talking about callers? But at the end of the day, all I asked was, why are you convinced? We can't have a discussion about what you should be convinced of until you explain why you're convinced.
Okay, there's a difference between being convinced and having a belief. So
no, there's not. No, there's not. Believing simply means that you are convinced that the proposition is likely true.
Okay, I'm convinced that intelligent life is likely.
I understand that. Why? What is the evidence that means that you should be convinced that there's intelligent life scattered throughout the universe?
Okay, you just asked two different questions, Matt. You asked why, and then you asked what is the evidence.
Yes, it's possible. It's possible that you could be convinced without evidence, but I would just dismiss that. So I'm wanting you to explain why you're convinced, and hopefully it's actual evidence.
I don't have actual evidence. I'm convinced.
Then why would you? So basically, you're saying you're convinced of something when you don't have evidence. Why would you do that,
Matt? Most of the people on the planet are...
I don't give a shit about most of the people on the planet. I don't give a shit about people who are holding wrong beliefs. I'm asking, why would you be convinced of something while you acknowledge that you don't have evidence for it?
Because it satisfies an emotional need.
Thank you. Is that a good way to go about determining whether or not something is true or whether or not something should be believed?
Well, can we get to my question, which is what is the standard of proof?
No, we can't.
Well, we're talking about the standard of proof.
We're talking about
the standard of proof.
Do you think that because it feels an emotional need is a good reason to be convinced something is true?
So what is the standard of proof that...
I just asked a question. You keep going back to what's the standard of proof. I cannot answer that because each proposition is different. I'm asking a question, which is, why do you think that it's okay and good to be convinced of something while acknowledging that you don't have evidence for it?
Because that's the world we live in.
No, it's not. Okay, you might as well be saying, look, all the village idiots believe stuff without evidence. Therefore, I'm in good company for believing stuff without evidence. But that is not what reason and epistemology are about. Sound epistemology doesn't go around going, you know what? If a bunch of people believe stuff, I'll just go ahead and do it too. That's called an argumentum ad populum, which is a logical fallacy.
I understand epistemology. What I'm telling you is,
evidently you don't.
You are describing a world that you wish to live in. And
No.
people base their beliefs.
No,
Oh, okay, okay. No,
so,
and partially, you're partially correct. I do wish I lived in a world where people were fucking rational instead of saying they believe stuff without evidence. Yes, I do wish I lived in that world because that's the preferable world.
That's the world you live in.
now, Mark, I actually agree with you, but my standard of my evidence is a little bit different than yours. I have a degree of confidence. I won't say a high degree of confidence. So we're not the only intelligent life in the universe, and that is based on one, the size of the universe is, as far as we know, infinite or so close to it, it doesn't really matter. It's much larger than we can see for certain. And two, it's happened once, and it seems likely to have happened a second time, but I can't actually discount the fact that we may be a complete stroke of luck within the universe. Do you see how what I just said is different from you going, it feels right? Because I can change your emotional state by changing the temperature. Because people get cranky when it gets hot.
Yes, and
so that's the standard of evidence.
All right, and I agree with that.
But it has nothing to do with emotion or how I feel, or it makes me feel more complete, or anything about emotion. It's simply a statement of facts with enough language to acknowledge that I don't have anything stronger than it's possible or probable.
There's a lot of evidence. There's a lot of evidence from cognitive brain science and human psychology that demonstrates that people do base their beliefs on their emotional state.
Mark.
They develop arguments to support those.
Mark, you're fucking muted now. You can talk to me all day long about how people go about making up their mind. That is not what epistemology is. Epistemology is about how people should make up their mind. Pointing to all the people who are irrational doesn't mean that you being irrational as well suddenly turns you into rational just because you're just as irrational as other people. That's not what epistemology is. That's not what sound reasoning is. So stop telling me what I already know, which is that there's a bunch of people out there who don't know how to reason and don't know how to determine whether or not something is believable. I already know that. You're one of them.
Okay, so if we could return to the starting point.
No, I'm going to drop you in just a second because I'd like you to stop going back to the starting point and acknowledge what's actually been said.
Okay, I acknowledge what has been said.
That's not quite how that works, but go ahead.
So, if I were to offer you a definition of God and ask you, because I've heard you say many, many times that the time to believe a proposition is when there is sufficient evidence to believe it. But we're not able to establish what sufficient evidence is until we establish a standard of proof. Is it probable cause?
That's not my problem. That's the problem of the people who are saying that they're justified in believing in a God. It's not my fault that the God you believe in doesn't have the ability to meet the standard of evidence that would be required to accept it. That's not my problem. That's your problem and your God's problem.
You don't know what my problem is because we haven't talked about the God that I believe.
I know what your problem is. I've pointed it out multiple times. You think you're perfectly justified in believing something because it fucking feels good. And that's not how reason works.
No, I didn't say I was justified in believing it. I said that is the honest answer.
Definitely did.
Why I believe it.
That's yes, and that has nothing to do with epistemology.
I can give you supporting evidence for what I believe in.
Sure. Define your God and start presenting evidence.
Okay, so we'll start with a definition of God.
Okay.
Universal consciousness, which is the ground of being.
I have no idea what that means.
I don't know what that. So first of all, I don't know how you would demonstrate a universal consciousness, but how do you demonstrate that a universal consciousness is the grounding of being? I'm not sure that being needs a grounding. Being just is.
Well, right. And so now we're circling back to where we were before, which is that I cannot demonstrate it, and I have no intent of demonstrating it.
Good. Then I'm going to hang up on you if Jim's okay with it, because I'm not interested in having conversation with people.
Once you say you're not interested in trying to prove it, I don't really care anymore.
I mean, that's like kind of the whole point of the fucking show is to call in and say, hey, here's what I believe and why. And when you say, I believe there's a universal consciousness that grounds all being, okay. I don't.
I have no idea what those words mean together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know.